everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Pop It Like It's Hot. We are sponsored, as always, by RIW Hobbies and Games in exquisite Livonia, Michigan. My name is Chris, and today I am joined by two of my wonderful co-hosts.
I'm Brian DeMars.
And this is Dave Polson.
So, fellas, I am going to be playing in a big tournament this weekend, the Pauper Format Playoff on Magic Online. And we also have another big tournament there in Livonia, the 1K with the Professor at RIW Hobbies. That's coming up on October 5th. And what I want to talk to you about today is what can I do to maximize my chances of placing well in this tournament? Or, what can you Michigan locals do to maximize your chances in the 1K?
I think that's a great question. And the topic of the show is definitely going to revolve around how to metagame better in Magic, and specifically in Pauper. So, Kyle, who is actually another Michigan player, Kyle Bogamus out of Ann Arbor, put out like a really good article about metagaming in general. Did you guys check that one out?
I did. His Q&A mailbag on Cool Stuff Inc.
Yep, good stuff.
So Kyle talks quite a bit about like what type of deck you should play in order to have the best position deck in the metagame. And one of the things that he points out is like there's always sort of like a bogeyman in the format, a best deck. And he generally likes to position himself in such a way that he doesn't really want to play the best deck because he feels like the best deck sort of draws a lot of hate. But he doesn't want to play a deck that's like metagame specifically to beat the best deck. He wants to sort of play like the second best deck that's dodging the most amount of hate.
Okay. So in Pauper, kind of what does that mean? What have some of the best positioned decks been lately? I mean, I know, let's see, Boggles has been positioned well, but I'm seeing a lot more Leave No Traces, a lot more Standard Bearers, a lot more Prismatic Strands. So I don't know how well positioned Boggles would be moving forward. And in these higher profile tournaments, you'll see some grinders that sort of get into this weird feedback loop where, they're picking what they think is the anti-meta deck. And so I never really know how to approach that and like how to pick my deck to sort of make sure I, am a level above the meta game, but not 2 levels above, because then you might as well just bring a bad deck. So
well, that's the big problem, is that it's so easy to look back at what happened last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and construct a narrative that makes it make sense to you, because like you have all of those results. But when you're trying to look forward, it's a lot more complicated because you don't know what's what yet. You don't know exactly what all of these random people are going to do and like how everything's going to fall into place. So I definitely think that Jeskai has emerged as like sort of the deck to beat. It's just like the best deck right now.
Yep.
Just in terms of like it puts up a lot of results, and also it's a huge chunk of the metagame. It's like that is the deck you are most likely to play against every round is going to be Jeskai. So like whatever deck you pick, you need to be aware that like your most probable possible opponent is going to be on Jeskai. And then if you're playing Jeskai, you also need to be aware that like everybody is preparing specifically for you because you're the most likely opponent they're going to face. So that's sort of like the overarching dynamic. But that deck, the Jeskai deck, the best deck, is rarely the true best deck in terms of like win percentage, unless it's like really absurd like Hogak. Like when Hogak is the most played deck and has the best win percentage, a ban is coming because that deck is just too good. Jeskai has like a pretty reasonable win percentage. It's not like winning like 60% of its games overall. It's close to a 50-50 deck as far as matchups, but it's good and it holds those tight matchups across the board, which is what leads it to be such a popular choice. So the thing we saw last week, 2 weeks ago, was that there was another really good deck. There was Boggles, and it just so happened to be really good against Jeskai. So as everybody was hating on Jeskai, the people who were playing Boggles could sort of sneak in and have a good matchup. And now we've seen that sort of corrected by the Jeskai decks hedging against Boggles becoming the first deck. So the key is, what's the next Boggles?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So, Dave, how do you kind of get into picking your deck?
Well, just to speak on Jeskai in general, I mean, the MCQ had 5 in the top 8 recently. I mean, we had 5 in the last challenge here, but a lot in that 5 and 2 space. I think they were just more prepared for a Boggles type deck. So I don't know if you could really take that down, but like I in the Pauper 1K at RIW in Livonia on October 5th coming up, I'm definitely not locking in right now. I'm waiting to see kind of what the metagame looks like, what kind of each week where we are, what the kind of adaptations are, where Jeskai ends up being. I know I don't want to play Jeskai, although I'm comfortable with the deck. I like it. It's not a play style I'm opposed to. But I'd rather pick the deck that, preys on either the boogeyman or I'm avoiding the hate. But I really couldn't tell you, how do you hate out the Jeskai decks? I really don't think you can. They're kind of all over the place with their lists. I have noticed they're kind of not, at least from this challenge result, they're not so heavy on the creature package. I don't know if any of them played like the 4 Glinthawk 19 creature form of the deck. They're all on kind of Pulse and Marasa, so they're all shifting into that longer control game kind of style. But I'll look at my play style and I'll kind of consider that. So I kind of want to keep pace on the format, see what I'm liking with that. But yeah, I mean, for me, I like to kind of be a step ahead, or kind of like the Kai Boggs article goes into is like, and I'm maybe paraphrasing in a way, but like I want to be 2 steps ahead. Like I want to beat the people that are beating the Jeskai decks. So I want to do that, but I guess I don't like admitting I don't think Jeskai is a deck you can just say, all right, I'll have a bad matchup against that deck. I think it's going to be very prevalent. I think, look at Boggles or any of the other, Stompy, maybe Elves to a lesser degree. I group Affinity and Elves kind of in that same percentage share of the metagame. I know, typically from the 1Ks we've seen, a lot of people have their pet decks, and there's nothing good that's going to move them off of that. So, I know there's a certain number of Reanimator guys, and there's a Flicker guy, and then there's a bunch of Elves guys, and like they're going to come with the deck. I know they're playing, and I can presumably mulligan round 1. Like if I'm faced against them before I even see what they're on or anything, I can like preemptively mulligan because I know what deck they're going to play. I think Pauper kind of lends itself to pet decks and people just locking in and being stuck on decks for a long time.
I think all Magic does that to some extent, like only 23% of people came to the Pro Tour playing Hogak when it was the best deck. Like I think that's just Magic. Like people play what they like and what they know.
Yeah, and we've seen plenty of examples that we're going to talk about a little bit later of people, even online, like the top grinders will do that. Like Amoris 27, Metzel, Hellsow, even though, Tron is maybe one of the more powerful decks. You just know what they're going to be on ahead of time. So, yeah, there is definitely some percentage of people that are doing that. But I don't think it's reasonable to kind of metagame or tune against those one-off situations you might run into. You just kind of have to be aware, you got to leverage your advantage in other places in those cases.
In other formats, I've seen decks like Jeskai be the best deck before. It's actually a lot like a Jund deck being the best deck, because it's kind of just like a mid-rangey deck. It's the strength of the deck is like, it's very cohesive. The overall quality of your cards is very high. You have like card advantage built in. You can get over people. You can get under people. So, like Boggles was the way to beat it, but now the Jeskais are good at beating Boggles. I kind of suspect that, like, I was sort of thinking about the K-Boggs article and what he would do. I bet he would play Tron.
Yeah.
He would come back on Tron, because I do think Tron is a deck that is inherently good against Boggles, or not Boggles, against Jeskai. And it's also just a powerful deck. Like, it's one of the best strategies in general. Now, the metagame has sort of gotten hostile towards Tron decks. At least it was hostile, with so many, like, one-drop decks and burn decks and just super fast linear decks. But maybe, like, a Tron deck that has, like, a cohesive plan for dealing with, like, fast aggression would be really well positioned in a metagame with a lot of Jeskai. So I kind of think that like that might be the next level, would be to come back to Tron with like a new version or a little bit better tuned version for exactly what's.
That makes a
Like-
lot of sense.
Yeah, for me, I don't want to play a Tron mirror ever. I've just seen how kind of those play out. I've seen what a paper event playing Tron looks like, and you just get draws. People feel like they don't want to scoop when you have it. And for me, just the tournament experience, I'm sure I'm not alone, but it's like, I don't want to play Tron for 7 rounds and duke it out, for 50, 60 minutes every round and see what happens, especially if the room's full of aggro players. So I know that's got to be a deterrent, even in paper, for a lot of players. And I feel like one of the most skill-intensive decks in Magic, regardless of format, to be honest. It's just a toolbox of a deck, and when you're really, equal, you're not very far ahead. You're having to think really deep into like what they have available potentially in their hand, what's left in my deck at all times. Like, it's okay when you're ahead, but when you're like in the even, it's like, I know you're always the control deck, but you still have a bevy of options. You got to kind of scan through them, and the time is like running out all the time, it feels like, for me.
Yeah, Tron
Yeah.
is definitely not a deck that's easy to just, pick up a week before the tournament and say, I'm going to attack this metagame with Tron, without having that familiarity with it and familiarity with those control mirrors and other matchups. It's an inherently powerful deck, but it's easy to lose with as well. And it's mentally taxing. If you don't know the lines like the back of your hand, especially in a paper tournament, it can, 6, 7 rounds in, it starts to get to you. Just mentally, like your mental fatigue level is very high that deep into a tournament with Tron.
I get, yeah. I mean, that's definitely true. It's definitely a little bit different style of a deck. I love playing it in tournaments though because you just demoralize your opponents so hard. They're just like, I give up. I yield. It's too much. You have
You
too
bring
much.
them down to your level and beat them with experience. So, I guess if you're taking a step back from, picking apart specific decks, I think it's important in analyzing a metagame to look at, the different archetypes you're going to run into. So I guess the question would be, when trying to evaluate how to attack a metagame like Pauper, how do we get more clinical in how we break down the different decks and the strategies we might face? I mean, on the surface level, you've got, Jeskai, aggro, combo, control, Tron, what have you. But what does that mean in the context of Pauper?
Well, that is a very, very tricky question because I think the best way to think about questions like that is whatever the way it makes most sense to you. Like it's a big abstract thing of like what are the relationships between different types of decks. So like I find it very hard to like think about those as like rigid black and white things that are just constant, but it has more to do with like how things match up against one another. But there are like you were saying, control, combo, aggro, like there are sort of big groups that we all kind of just agree are things. You know what I mean? Like if I said
Yeah.
like what kind of a deck is Stompy? Like what would you guys say?
Yeah, it's an aggro deck.
Right, it's aggro for sure. It's very easy. But then like what kind of a deck is Burn in Pauper?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue for a lot of different things with Burn. Is it combo? Is it aggro? Is it tempo? Like, that's hard to say.
Because
Yeah,
it's not obvious. It's how are you thinking about it? And I think like a lot of like when you really think about it, what it is depends a lot on what you're playing. Like how is the matchup playing out? Like if you're playing Burn and I'm playing, some other deck, like the matchup might play out like you're a Storm deck in a lot of ways. It's just like how fast can you resolve enough spells to kill me before I kill you? It might play out like you're playing combo, but if I'm playing like a control deck that gains life, then like it feels more like I'm playing against an aggro deck. So like it's not, I don't think about it as like rigid categories. I tend to think about it more like relationships between matchups.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely. Go ahead, Dave.
I think, labeling it kind of helps you identify how to group it. But like you said, Brian, like when I think of, hey, is Burn a combo deck or an aggro deck or what is it? I'm like, well, what is ramp? Like, what is it when Modern Tron goes turn 3 Karn? Was that a combo? Like, it feels kind of like a combo, but like it kind of, again, like defeats the purpose of such rigid thinking. So I'm definitely on that camp of being open to the cards are just the cards. We're trying to identify, group these decks to kind of try and combat them. But for the sake of progress, I don't think I don't think Burn is a combo deck. I think it's more of an archetype and more of you know people who say it's a combo deck. I mean, is a lava act or a lava spike to the face 1/7 of the combo going off? Like, it doesn't feel like that. It just feels like you just lightning bolted me in the face on turn 1. So, but I think just for how it helps you kind of attack those decks, I think that's a good thing. But I think it needs to be analyzed how you break down specific card choices, because then it kind of gives you specific answers, and not just because if we just grouped Burn as the same as Stompy, we'd leave out the fact that, well, if I lock most aggro decks out of combat, Burn just kills me. It's like, oh, okay, well, so they're different, right? Yeah, so like kind of identifying how they're different and how they're similar is part of that, but grouping them and saying, okay, these sideboard cards are for aggro, these sideboard cards are for control, is, I think that's where you fall victim of being too general. But yeah, I think, maybe when you're looking at your own card choices in your deck and how you're constructing it, you can say, okay, these, maybe like Weather the Storm is good against aggro, or how I build my deck, I'm playing spells that matter in turns 1 and 2 more. So like the aggro decks, I have more action in the early part of the game where they're interacting with me. Something like that is beneficial, but I think being too rigid isn't beneficial. So I definitely agree with Brian's take on, being open-minded about identifying decks as, lump them all into this category or this one, and then nothing. There's no outliers. Like, there's nothing that falls outside of that. I think is, a good way to approach it for sure.
And I think that's a great point that you hit on, where there's like abstract thinking about what kind of a deck is this and what archetype is it, and then there's also the practical side of it, of like, when I sit down to play against it, what is my plan? Like you mentioned,
Right.
Clearly, like, Burn is an aggressive deck, but like, I can't have this if my plan for aggro decks is like the same versus Burn versus Stompy versus Elves. Like, I need different types of cards to cover those bases. Like, there's no generic catch-all for like aggro. So like, you need to think about it in a broader way, or like not a broader way, a more specific way, is what I meant to say there.
Yeah, so I'll wax poetically for a minute here, and then I'll pass the baton off.
Thank you, finally.
Okay, yeah. So for me, an archetype is like a river. So even if you're locked into the same 75 as you played 2 months earlier, or even further back, it's going to be different because its general position in the metagame has changed because of, you can't just look at your 75 in a vacuum and say, okay, I'm going to have the same matchups. They're all going to be playing the same cards. I can expect the same result, all this. So I think it's important to look at the exact card choices in your deck and their deck. So take a look at Stompy, for example. Or, are they Stompy with River Boa? Are they on 4 River Boa? Or are they on 2? Are they cutting Quarian Ranger for some reason? Are they Jeskai with 19 creatures and Glenhawks? Are they, so if they're on 4 Glenhawks, they're playing more artifacts to play that, so it kind of opportunity cost there. I think commonplace now is they're all on Pulse Marasa and 9 creatures, so that's kind of where that's shifted. Maybe in 2 weeks, who knows where the evolution takes them. But I know last week on the challenge we saw Boros Bole with Seal of Fire, and Tyler's Tribe adopting Prismatic Strands. We've seen Spellstutter Sprite adopted into some number of the Jeskai list. It's just on and on with kind of where things are going, and you got to look at the specifics. Early game is the early game, but then late game, when it starts getting nitty gritty, and let's say you're the control deck, you're trying to figure all the outs they have. You want to know what those known commodities are, so you have some type of answer. Because I think that's where the advantage of these 1 and 2 ofs in your deck at all. Like if I don't know you have Pulse Marasa in your Jeskai list, and I'm acting as though you don't. It's just a total blowout when they go and do it. Flash in a Spellstutter Sprite, counter the spell. Like, just all sorts of things happen from these one-offs or two-offs that make the world for how the decks compare to each other.
Dave, your use of metaphor just swept me away to a beautiful place, but I think you made a lot of good points at the same time. I did want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned the Boros Bully with Seal of Fire. Methodical, I believe it was 2 challenges ago, ran that to the top 8. And we talked about it a little bit on the show, but I don't think we gave it quite the credit it deserves. In hindsight, looking back, it was a great choice. It was exactly kind of what we were getting at here, put into practice. So Boros Bully, it's an aggro deck that really saw its heyday back in the Delver meta. It was a take on the Boros deck that kind of trimmed on Monarch, went to a lot more graveyard recursion cards like flashback spells. It wins off the back of what's it called? Rally the Peasants with a lot of 1/1s. But his use of Seal of Fire and the Pyroblast in the sideboard was really what positioned the deck well in the current meta. Seal of Fire being essentially a 0 mana counter ephemerate once you have it on the field was a really prescient choice. I liked it a lot. I've been running it in my Boros list. Props to Methodical for that bit of spicy tech. It's won me a lot of tickets this past couple of weeks, so I did want to bring that up one more time.
Real quick, I love how the Boros deck, or the Boros Bully deck specifically, like usually 4 strands, 4 screech, and you just kind of play that game of like, okay, you're Faithless Looting to cut down on some of the mana you'd likely have, but it's like, okay, strands with my mana, next turn, play a bunch of guys, and strands by tapping a guy. Like, you're just playing that game of like, I'm going to fog you out, and I'm going to attack you in the air, and every other turn I'm going to develop my board and just like get to a game state where like I'm just going to blow you out in that pattern of turns. It's just, I think that's really what the deck's about. But yeah, Seal of Fire, definitely think outside the box. Gotta love that innovation.
Absolutely. So I guess, let's see. What else goes into prep outside of, deck choice? That's definitely a big piece of it. Like deck choice, meta analysis. These are valuable tools. They're positive EV for any tournament you want to join. But I think it's important to kind of consider the other factors that are ultimately going to lead to the success in a larger tournament. Nick, we were talking to him before the show. He mentioned strong play skill. Obviously get better, do better. But informed by, familiarity with your own deck, making sure all 75 of your cards matter. Don't just have, cards in there because you think it fits. Make sure they have a purpose. And knowing what your deck's strengths and weaknesses are, and the weaknesses and strengths of your opponent's decks. I think all of these can be leveraged equally to deck choice, in making you a more successful tournament player. And I guess some of the examples of that, in practice, like we mentioned, Amoros 27, he has very high play skill, very high familiarity with his Orzhov Pestilence deck, and he is maybe leveraging that deck to perform at a rate above what you might expect it to. Metzel, obviously, we bring him up, I feel like, on every podcast because he continues to do amazing things with Mono Blue Delver. He's come to know his deck so intimately that he's capable of making dramatic shifts in his play patterns to achieve success, even if the meta has changed from, the heyday of Mono Blue Delver. And, Nick went on to say, he would argue that a player with a lot of Magic playing experience who maybe has a limited or just a passing familiarity with Pauper as a format and the deck that they're playing, like, for instance, say, a good player picked up Jeskai and went to play a tournament with it, regardless of whether or not he might have selected the quote-unquote perfect deck to attack a meta, I think players with a high level of skill and a high level of familiarity with their own deck and its matchups are going to have a decided advantage in that matchup despite the disparity and maybe experience playing the game. What would your commentary be there, Brian?
Well, I think there's a strong correlation between like being a really good technical player and also being good at choosing a deck. Like, just as like an abstract thought exercise, like think about whoever you think is like the best Magic player in the world. Maybe it's like LSV, maybe it's Reed Duke. Just someone who we all agree is just a great player, that they tend to always be successful because they're a really skilled player. So even if that player had never played a single game of Pauper in their entire life and really was not familiar with the format, if they were going to like go play in like a Grand Prix or something, if there was a Pauper Grand Prix, and they wanted to do well, even with minimal homework, they could probably just like go look at deck lists on MTG Top 8, see what the decks that are winning right now are, see what the percentages of the winners metagame and the regular metagame are. And they would probably just choose like whatever the best deck is, or like maybe the second best deck, one of the best decks. And they would just play it, and they would just make good plays. Like they would look at a board, they'd be like, well, I need to like play this, this, and this. And even without like all of the nuanced information, they would still play at an extremely high level. So I think that like I sorry, I got
Yeah. No, I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I definitely think that your point is correct. But the point I was trying to get at, I guess, with my statement was that there are other factors other than just raw, Magic experience and play skill. Like maybe, Reed Duke and LSV have sort of transcended that idea with, they're just exceptional players that really don't have a rival in terms of how just naturally good they are at Magic. But, your average, like, person who's doing well at modern events or whatever, your GP grinder or whatever, them jumping into Pauper for a tournament, they're not going to have quite the edge they have in their format of choice that somebody who has more experience with all the decks of Pauper and how they interact with each other would have.
well,
I would disagree, just because in modern, you probably make a few mistakes, maybe just one, and you lose. I think Pauper has a little leeway. Like, if Reed Duke came here for the 1K, I will bet you $100 he will top 8. And if like he like forced everybody to play it out, I'll bet another $100 he'll get second at least. Like, it's
Yeah.
just, for me, I feel like when it starts getting real tight and like, oh, I'm doing good, oh man, like, I'll mess it up. I feel like that's just my shortcoming as a player, and I don't fret about it. Like, I still enjoy the game, but I just have noticed like I was in the finals of a GP, and it was like, or not a GP, sorry, a GP trial, and it was like, oh, let's just split. All right, we're both not going here. Like, okay, I've made it this far. Like, I don't want to push it anymore. Like, I've made it to top 8s and just been kind of like, all right, shove all in, I don't care type of stuff, where it's like, what am I doing? Like, that's not what I would normally do, but like, I just feel like the pressure getting to me. And like, I feel like I'm not alone for sure. A lot of players kind of, when they look back at, they're like, oh, like, I remember playing at Greek Town and being like, oh, I didn't go all in and I had aces and I would have won. Like, oh, that hits me just the same way as like in a Magic tournament, where like I made a mistake because I got playing very tight. And it's just like later in the rounds, it gets kind of more pressure, and you put that undue pressure on yourself, and you make yourself make mistakes. Whereas like a player who's seasoned, been there before, yeah, if LSV came here, or Reed Duke or whomever, yeah, I feel like they would run over most of the tournament all the way to the finals. So yeah,
Yeah.
just yeah,
where I was
pressure
going
gets to
with
most
with
players.
my story that I never really got there, but
Sorry. Go ahead. Let's.
is the whole point of that story is with really strong players who, you think of, you were saying like you think they're just going to come here and beat you up with their play skill. I think there's a really big correlation between being a strong player and just selecting strong decks in general. Like, you never see like Seth Manfield play a bad deck. You never see LSV play a bad deck. Like, they're always playing one of the best 3 possible decks you can play. They don't always hit the best deck, but they're always like within the top 3. And then a big part of the play skill is just making competent plays, like not making careless mistakes, not making obvious mistakes, just looking at the information that's available to you, and making a play that makes a lot of sense to you. So like It's not that they're like sitting down with a bad deck and they're just going to somehow outplay you. It's they're going to outlast you. They're not going to make careless mistakes, and they're going to draw on their experience to just make 15 solid plays in a row. It's not when you lose games of Magic, it's not usually like, wow, I didn't see that Pyroblast coming. It's like, I hope he doesn't have Pyroblast because I can't beat it, but I have to make this play. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair.
There's a lot of parity. There's so much
completely on board with
parity in the gameplay of Magic. It's like, I don't play against people very often that are just like, wow, I had no idea that you were going to play a Karn on turn 3 in your Modern Tron deck. Like, everybody knows what's up. It comes down to cards, and it comes down to what cards you put in your deck. It's like the biggest thing that separates, an A plus from an A, or an A from a B.
My thing, I hear a lot of players, maybe they reach a certain plateau and they'll start blaming variants or their draws or who they're matched up with. And my thing is like, well, you had a choice of what deck you were going to play at the very start of the tournament. Like the tournament didn't start in round 1 when the clock started. Like, it started when you started preparing and locking into a deck. Like, you could have locked into a completely different deck. Like, granted, you could have got pairings are random. You could have, things could have shaken a totally different way based on randomization and who you're paired against. But like, I think not enough players look at their deck selection. And Brian, you wrote a recent article about this where deck selection is very important. And we all kind of went back and forth on that. And I'm in the camp of, I think that's the number one choice you make that determines your outcome. Things could have broke a different way, but you can look at the tournament results of how many people played X deck, and were you hedging to beat that deck, or did you have a great plan against the top performers? So yeah, it's that a lot of players don't look at enough, where they kind of blame the outside factors and luck and variance too much, when instead of looking at, well, what about choice 1 where you chose to bring this control deck, ignoring the fact that you were going to get preyed upon, or, it's all anticipation. You don't know for sure. If we all did, we'd lock into the best 75 every time. But like, it's kind of knowing where we're at in the metagame and kind of getting a good read on where things are shifting.
I mean, it's a huge decision. It's what strategy are you going to take to this tournament? Do I want to be an aggressive strategy? Do I want to be a mid-range strategy? Like, do I want to be a combo strategy? Do I want to be linear? Do I want to be flexible? Like, that's a big choice. And like, depending on what everybody else is doing, like, one of those choices is likely much better than the other 3 for that event.
Yeah.
Your pairings might not reflect that. You might get the, if you're going if it's a rock, scissors, paper sort of a deal, you could, pull paper 4 times and be, really sad with your choice. But I also think a lot of times people who plateau, it's because they're not willing to be flexible about the deck that they're taking. Like, if your deck choice is, I want to play Jund, and Jund is like the 4th best option, like, you're always taking the 4th best option into your tournament. Like, you're never playing the option that gives you the best chance to like really hit a bunch of good pairings despite the event. And like that's why you're not making as many top 8s when you do that.
Yeah,
Deck is just weaker positioned than other decks were. So even if you don't make any mistakes, the mistake was the deck that you picked.
Yeah, I think you have to be a seasoned player with experience and a deep knowledge to make those audibles to a completely left field deck. Like, let's say you've been playing aggro and then suddenly control is the best deck. You're not really in the best position, if you've never played a control deck period, or never played that iteration, or have very little experience to audible to that deck. I think that's it's got to be within your wheelhouse to make that audible. But yeah, I mean, you could look at numbers, or you could look at, where things are going, or there could be a hot deck like, Hogak or Jeskai, and say, this is the hot deck, you got to play it. But if, like for me, if Tribe was the best deck, I haven't played it. I've looked at it and said, man, if I just blow the 1 combo turn, I'm losing. I think Tron is the same way. Like, a burn player who doesn't have any experience with Tron, them just audibling to Tron at the last minute isn't really a realistic strategy. But I think that's where you take your like learnings as a player and say, okay, well, if I really am serious about winning, and I know Pauper can lend itself to people wanting to play their deck, and not everybody's out here to be a spike and win everything at the cost of some people are just out here to have fun. It's a game. At the end of the day, you're winning by just being able to play the game. But like there's if you're just a burn player at heart, Tron may not be a deck you can just audible to.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that point up. I read a great article. It's been a few years ago now, I believe, and I'm sure our listeners will correct me if I'm wrong on the details, but I believe it was Paulo Vitor Damadurosa wrote it for Channel Fireball, and his take on the situation was that you have to choose the best deck for you. So there's going to be a few decks in the tournament that you might be able to rate at a 10 out of 10 for power level. But if you are only going to get 50% of the value out of that deck that you could get, that deck for you is a 5 out of a 10. If you are 100% proficient with a burn deck, for instance, that might be in this meta a 7 out of 10. I'm kind of pulling numbers out of thin air. But if the deck you like is a 7 out of 10, but you're going to get all the value out of that deck that's possible to get, that deck is going to perform better for you than the Jeskai deck that we talked about. And, looking at it that way, it can kind of help you make your own personal evaluation of a deck. So, obviously, a highly skilled player, like we were talking about, Reduke or LSV, they're going to get the value out of any deck that they play. So they want to pick the best deck because it's going to give them the best chance to win. But for mere mortals, like, myself and Dave, we have to pick the deck that we have a combination of experience with, good to great meta selection, and having familiarity with the other decks that we're going to play so that we make sure to maximize the value we're getting out of all of our plays.
One of the great things about Pauper is that it's the cost of entry is so much lower than other formats. I think I agree with that for a format like Modern, where you just sort of like spend your $800 to build whatever you think a good Modern deck is, and then you just ride out the metagame with it. Like the metagame kind of goes through cycles where like everything gets good for a little while and then waxes and wanes. But it's not really reasonable to be like, I'm going to buy this 800 deck, and now next week there's a deck that's a little bit better positioned, so I'll buy that 800 deck. In Pauper, like, the decks are pretty cheap. Like,
yeah,
you can build them really easily. Like, on Moto, like, I wrote an article recently where, like, the entire 75 was, like, 11 picks or something. So, in Pauper, you can actually, like, I think it's much more reasonable to be good with a bunch of different decks. Because, like, you can actually, like, own them and practice with them and learn how to play them.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which I think gives you a huge advantage metagaming when it's not like the only deck I can play is Jeskai. But if like you own like 5 or 6 different decks, which is still much less than owning a Modern deck, you could be proficient with a bunch of different strategies. And if you're proficient with 5 different strategies, you can play like all.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've spent a lot of time this week kind of talking about different things that can be done to maximize your expected value out of a tournament. Analyzing the meta, knowledge of the format, familiarity with the deck that you choose, and then obviously, play skill, the kind of ephemeral, get better at Magic. So I guess concretely, what can somebody like me or our listeners who are looking to improve, what can they do or what can I do to improve in these areas?
Well,
like kind of concretely,
just as like really easy things that will actually impact your game positively for play skill. I think rather than focusing on like how do I know the difference between 45% and 46%, play to win the game, really work on cleaning up the careless mistakes. A careless mistake costs you so much more than a great play gains you. A great play might be 2 percentage points, based on what your opponent draws. It's very, very small how one was better. Whereas like a careless mistake, you could be 100% to win the game, tap the wrong land, and you're dead. So like most of the time, people don't make careless mistakes. We don't. Everyone just doesn't go around punting every single turn, but like really work on your focus.
Speak for yourself.
I've seen you play. You're very good. But like honing in that laser focus, that's the big thing. Just controlling the things that you know how to control and keeping those in front of you is really huge on play skill, I think. That's one of the things the best players do. I mentioned earlier they outlast more than they outplay. Like if waiting for someone else to make the mistake that you can capitalize on wins you the game. Like you didn't even have to do anything super great or complicated. You just waited for a window and then you just jammed your cards in there and won the game.
Okay. And I think one way that it's easy to kind of improve in that area, because that was something I struggled with, especially as a newer player, was how do I know when I made a mistake? It's easy, like when it loses you the game, it's easy to say, oh, maybe, I shouldn't have tapped my last blue source or whatever the case may be. But I think the advice I would have, just generally for this is be deliberate about improving at Magic. Like when you play a match, take time afterwards to think through some of the lines, whether you won or lost, reflect on kind of what you did right and what you did wrong. Don't, be results oriented. Take a look at each individual play and how you could have maximized your edge there. And a great way to kind of, maybe see some of the lines that you're not seeing is follow experienced players. There's so many resources. I mean, we have our own YouTube channel that we're going to be putting content on. Plenty of people are streaming on Twitch, YouTube. See how they're approaching the game and how they approach the different situations that you might find yourself in. And that can be an easy way to, gain yourself some percentage points in a matchup.
Another thing to keep in mind for perspective is everybody is people are what they are right now as far as skill. Like we all have played the games of Magic we've played, we've processed them, we have those experiences. Everyone's at a different place. Like I couldn't just play a bunch of Magic, over the span of the next 3 nights and like becomes a significantly better player. Like it's a process. It's a lifetime thing. So you can't just spike it and get real good real fast. Like it's about like learning about how the game works, learning about what's important on different boards. It's something that takes time to do. So, keep that in mind too. You can't like dramatically improve really quickly. Like it takes time. It takes reflection. It takes like learning about what's going on. And the thing that always throws the wrench in is the game is always changing. So even if you get really good, if you wait a year, the game will be very different, and you'll have whole different things to process and take into consideration.
For
It's
sure.
about creative problem solving.
Yeah, I think if you get a good play group, that's probably the best thing you could do. If you get a good shop that has a nice community, you can kind of feed off each other, watching games when you're not playing. You could even go to a big tournament and just watch, trade, pick up side games, just being involved with it. There's so many videos online you can learn, by just watching really. But, jumping in, getting in there. I think if you're not at the play skill you really want to be, you can definitely pick a deck that caters to that play style and kind of knowing where you're at. I think another big thing is looking at tournament results, all of them, and keeping a good beat on the format of why is this different than last week? What does this do? Like understanding the choices of cards, and just trying to get a good picture of deck building choices. So maybe, there's deck building as well as play skill, but play skill takes a lot of time. I think draft is one of the most skill intensive where your mistakes are punished the most. Do a bunch of 4-man drafts with a bunch of people who are better than you. Go and see how that goes. Like it's going to cost you some money. You're going to learn the most, but being around players that are better than you and being like that weak wobbly leg on the table or being that weak link in the chain, like you'll really try and get better. But you got to put in time. I think all of that. It's a time. A lot of people put a lot of time into this game. But there's a lot of resources that weren't available 10, 15 years ago. It's just very rapid how quick things evolve, and the amount of resources there are now. It's just you can constantly, if you have downtime, be entertained with this game. So that entertainment turns to learning. It's kind of like I used to teach chess, and it's like teaching fourth grader chess. It's like, yeah, they're playing a game, but they're learning. Like, we're disguising it as a game, but like throughout this whole thing, they're learning problem solving skills, like both analytical, and then Magic, you have deck building, so it's both creative. So it's really just growing your brain. You don't go from being some dumbass to being very smart overnight. Like, for me, after I played a bunch of Magic and was in the tournament scene, played so much, college became very boring, and it was just a matter of time and money. It wasn't like classes were very hard. Like, Magic brought me to a point where the classes were just kind of frustrating, and I just had to okay, I got to put in the time and money, but this is not hard. Like, I'm going to approach this classroom situation, and this applies as well to business, but as a tournament. Like, I'm going to approach everybody as my opponent. I'm going to take every little edge I can, and Magic is a big life learning experience if you let it. I think some people don't let it make them learn some of those life lessons or apply them to life lessons, but it isn't just like Ryan said. You can't just, let me put in a good 8 hours, 2 days, 3 days, and I'm gonna spike this next tournament based off of my raw talent. It takes a long time. We've been at it for how long? And how many people have you talked to who have been like, I've been here since 1994. What's up? And it's yeah, I'm just walking into the bar. You basically built the bar from the ground up, and we're all just here hanging out. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a game. So it depends on what you want to get out of it. But if it's tournament results, you got to put in the time, you got to put in the effort, and you got to, get in where you fit in. I mean, maybe it's, maybe you're a brewer, maybe you're a spike. There's a lot of avenues you could take. Yeah, that's my take.
Dave, yet again, your use of metaphor has blown me away. And you guys heard it here first. Magic the Gathering will teach you how to angle shoot your way through college. So I think we're going to end it right there on that. We're kind of coming up on time. I can hear the Pauper players building themselves into a frenzy there at RIW. So was there any last words anybody wanted to let people know about before we end the show?
October 5th, RIW of Livonia, Michigan, 1K. The professor's going to be here. That's it.
I'll be doing commentary.
Very exciting.
So I'm sure check it out on the RIW Twitch.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to be doing some additional content along with the 1K that you'll be able to find either on our podcast stream or on our YouTube channel. I do want to call out one piece of content that we're going to be releasing in a little bit different way. We did a long-form interview with Chris Van Meter, who won the Pauper Premier League recently. It's going to be available on our YouTube channel. You can look it up, Pop It Like It's Hot on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe there. We're going to be putting a lot more content there here very soon. Other than that, thank you for listening. We look forward to you tuning in again next week, and have a good one.
Pop it like it's hot. Pop it like it's hot. Pop it like it's hot.